Picture this. 4 World War II aircraft engines bolted together in a row, 48 cylinders, nearly 7,000 cubic inches of displacement, and enough theoretical horsepower to make every top-fuel dragster on the planet look like a golf cart. Now imagine that this machine, this absolute fever dream of mechanical ambition, never moved a single inch under its own power. Not 1 inch. Ever. That is the story of the Quad L, and I promise you, the closer you look at it, the more insane it gets. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the forgotten machines and the brilliant, stubborn men who built them in obscurity. If you're someone who loves deep dives into the wildest, most outlandish chapters of American hot rod and drag racing history, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, here's the thing. Most people who have seen photographs of the Quad L floating around the internet for years assume they understand what they're looking at. They see the 4 massive engines, the almost comically tiny coupe body perched on top, the 8 slick tires, and they think, yeah, okay, wild show car, cool concept. But that reading of it is completely wrong. The Quad L was not a show car. It was not a promotional stunt. It was not built by a factory, a corporation, or a team of engineers with unlimited resources. It was built by one guy, in his shop, for roughly $2,000 using surplus military hardware that was so cheap it averaged out to about 5 cents per horsepower. And to truly understand how something like that is even possible, you have to start at the beginning. You have to start with the man himself. Jim Lytle grew up in Michigan as a curious, mechanically minded kid. And look, that description gets applied to a lot of people in hot rod history, but with Lytle, you need to understand that it was operating at a different level than most. He wasn't just a kid who liked cars. He was a kid who could figure out how things worked, tear them apart, improve them, and put them back together in a way that often made more sense than the original. He was a builder in the truest sense of that word. Not an assembler, not a guy who bolted catalog parts together. An actual builder. But when he was 15 years old, something happened that redirected all of that mechanical energy toward a very specific vision. He attended the Gold Cup hydroplane races on the Detroit River. And what he saw there, the sight and the sound of those massive racing boats, hit him the way very few things hit a 15-year-old kid. The top hydroplanes of that era were powered by giant piston aircraft engines, typically Allison V12s. And these things were not quiet or subtle. They were the loudest, most violent, most overwhelming mechanical objects that most people in 1952 had ever encountered up close. The sound alone could rearrange something in your chest. For young Jim Lytle, it apparently rearranged his entire future. Fast forward just 3 years. The fledgling NHRA is holding a sanctioned event in Livonia, Michigan. Lytle is there. So are the Arfons brothers with Green Monster 2, their Allison-powered, all-conquering drag machine. And now the two worlds that had been forming in his imagination, the aircraft engine horsepower he had witnessed on the water and the raw competition of drag racing, they collide into one idea. The course of Jim Lytle's hot rodding life had been permanently set. We jump forward to 1961. The world learns of Jim Lytle's existence through the May issue of Hot Rod magazine. His immaculate Hemi-powered Ford coupe, a car he had built while serving in the Army and which brought him to Texas in the first place, was featured in the story. The car was flawless in every detail. At the track, it could run with the best of them. It showed well. It ran well. And it summed up Lytle's skill set as a builder and as a gearhead with almost perfect clarity. Here's a detail that tells you everything about this guy. At just 24 years old, he had already owned 26 cars. 26 cars by his mid-20s. The man processed automobiles the way most people process paperback novels. Later that same year, while talking to a fellow hot rodder, the subject of airplane engines came up in conversation. Overhearing them, another man casually mentioned that there was a junkyard just down the road that had a couple of the exact engines they were discussing. Now, Lytle had been planning to drop a big Buick engine into the chopped 1934 Ford Tudor sedan he was building at the time. That was the plan. That was the sensible, achievable, reasonable plan. But this overheard conversation changed everything. One trip to that junkyard and $100 later, Jim Lytle owned a V12 Allison aircraft engine. And before we go any further, we absolutely need to talk about these Allison engines and why they matter so much to this entire story. The Allison V1710 was a 60-degree V12 that displaced 1,710 cubic inches. That is 28 liters out of 12 cylinders. Single overhead cam, liquid-cooled, and in military trim these engines made anywhere from 1,100 to 1,600 horsepower depending on the variant. War emergency power versions pushed well past 2,300. Modified for unlimited hydroplane racing, the best of them were hitting 3,000 horsepower. These were engines that helped win the Second World War. They powered P-38 Lightnings. They powered early versions of the P-40 Warhawk. They were serious, purpose-built, extraordinarily capable machines. And here is the thing that made all of this possible for guys like Lytle. In the early 1960s, you could buy these engines all day long for somewhere between $50 and $150 at military surplus auctions. The post-war surplus market had created this brief, almost miraculous window where hardware that the government had spent enormous resources developing and manufacturing was being essentially given away. 50 cents on the dollar became 5 cents on the horsepower. And if you had the mechanical skills and the vision to actually make it work in a hot rod application, the power was, for all practical purposes, free. So after roughly 6 months of work, and about $1,000 in parts, that Allison engine was running inside Jim Lytle's 1934 Ford Tudor sedan. He called it Big Al, and he needed somewhere to prove it worked. How about the 1962 NHRA Nationals in Dallas? On his very first pass down the strip, the car destroyed the clutch, went 77 miles per hour, and sent Jim directly back to the drawing board. But here's where you start to see what kind of guy Lytle really was. Most people, faced with a destroyed clutch on a one-of-a-kind aircraft engine-powered drag car, would have started making phone calls. They would have tried to source something close enough, something that might work, something from a catalog or a supplier. Lytle did none of that. On his own, working through the problem from first principles, he invented drag racing's first 4-disc clutch. He did not find a solution. He created one because the solution did not exist yet. And while he was at it, he also scratch-built a 14-inch diameter torque tube that tied the front of the car to the rear axle. This tube also acted as a flywheel shield and helped prevent the massive torque output of the Allison from literally twisting the car into 2 separate pieces. The man encountered a problem that had no existing answer, and he manufactured the answer himself out of raw material and applied intelligence. That pattern, problem followed by self-invented solution, is going to repeat itself over and over throughout this entire story. In early 1963, Jim showed up at Lyon's Dragstrip in Wilmington, California. The car ran 11s at 133 miles per hour and landed on the pages of the legendary Drag News magazine shortly after. Word was getting out. This thing was real. He relocated to Southern California in 1964, which put him in the center of the drag racing universe at arguably its most exciting moment in history. Eventually Big Al was running 10.56 seconds at 147 miles per hour. Those are numbers that would have been completely competitive at the top levels of the sport. But there was a massive and genuinely terrifying problem that had developed. The air pressure building up inside the body at speed was causing the doors to rip open mid-run. The hood was flying off. Jim Lytle was making 150-mile-per-hour passes while his car was actively trying to disassemble itself around him. Something had to change, and what had to change was the entire body of the car. The man needed a one-piece body. A single unit that air pressure could not find a seam in, could not pry apart, could not separate from itself at the worst possible moment. But he had never built anything like that before and had no idea how to approach it. However, a man named Fred Carroll did. Carroll owned and operated Fibercraft Filaments, which was at that time the leading fiberglass components company in the country. Lytle met him in the pits, which tells you something about the world of drag racing in 1964. The guy who could solve your problem was often just a few cars down in the staging lanes. Jim asked Carroll directly whether it was even possible to make a one-piece fiberglass sedan body. Carroll told him it was not only possible, but that he would help Lytle through the entire process. He sold Jim all his materials at cost and remained available to answer questions throughout the build. This was the culture. This was how things got done. Jim, the man who could seemingly do anything he put his hands to, proceeded with characteristic intensity. He built a 5-piece mold off his existing car, with one significant change from the original. The Tudor, which had already been chopped 6 inches, got chopped another 6 inches on top of that. This dropped the roofline so dramatically low that Lytle could have his head sticking out of the top of the car for visibility. And no, that is not an exaggeration made for entertainment. The windows on the finished body were essentially cosmetic and approximately 1 inch tall. The car was not designed for you to see out of in any conventional sense. It was designed to go fast and stay in one piece while doing it. 5 months later, the one-piece fiberglass body, painted in Bahama blue and finished to a standard that appeared near flawless, was mounted on the chassis. The whole car was then put on display at the 1964 NHRA Winter Nationals Car Show in Pomona. Now here is something that needs to be said clearly and with appropriate emphasis. This was the first one-piece fiberglass sedan body ever built anywhere in the world. Small fiberglass sports cars had existed for years. The Corvette had been using fiberglass since 1953. But a full sedan body, a recognizable American coupe silhouette, rendered as a single liftoff unit in fiberglass? That had never been done before. Jim Lytle did it in his shop. Now, here is where it gets really interesting, because the ripple effects of what Lytle built in that shop extended far beyond anything he could have anticipated at the time. Fran Hernandez, who ran Ford's experimental division, saw Big Al 2 at the Pomona show. Years later, in the 1980s, when pressed by journalists about the origins of the factory funny car program, Hernandez admitted publicly that when management came to him in 1965 demanding a way to compete with the Chrysler Hemi cars on the drag strip, it was this car and this specific body concept that served as the direct inspiration for the first liftoff funny car bodies ever produced by a factory, which appeared in 1966. If you want additional proof of that lineage, consider this detail. Those original 1966 factory funny cars had bodies that lifted completely straight off the chassis. They were not hinged at the rear the way funny car bodies are today. They lifted straight up and off, exactly the way Lytle had done it. The hinge came later. The concept came from a guy in Southern California who needed his doors to stop flying open at 150 miles per hour. So how did Big Al 2 perform at the track with its revolutionary new body? At 2,850 pounds and packing what amounted to roughly 2,300 horsepower worth of Allison engine, along with all the improvements the one-piece body provided, it had to be dramatically better than before. And it was. The car ran 9.31 seconds at 163 miles per hour on its best pass with Lytle at the wheel. To put that in context, this was nearly a full second quicker and 15 miles per hour faster than any full-bodied car on the planet at that time. Not just competitive. Dominant. Historically dominant. Now, you might be thinking that maintaining an aircraft engine in a drag car must have been an absolute nightmare of complexity and constant mechanical attention. Here is what most people don't realize about how Lytle operated this car. He changed the oil once a year. He never changed the spark plugs. He never broke anything significant. And he never lifted. Not once. Full throttle, every single pass, in a car making over 2,000 horsepower, with an engine designed for a fighter plane, and the maintenance schedule of a family sedan. Jim Lytle made 9 runs at Lyon's dragstrip over the course of July 1964 and then sold the car on the spot to Ray Alley for $2,000, making a small profit in the process. Alley toured the car through 1965 and 1966, then sold it to a man named Tex Collins in 1967, and we will get back to Collins in a moment because his story is one of the stranger threads in all of this. But the immediate question is, why did Lytle sell it in the first place? The car was the fastest full-bodied machine on Earth. It was working perfectly. It was getting attention from the entire industry. Why walk away? The answer is that Lytle was fundamentally a builder and a mechanic, not a racer. The act of creation was the point for him. The competition was almost secondary. And by the winter of 1964, before Big L2 had ever even made its first pass at the strip with the new body, he already had another project taking shape in his mind. A project so ambitious, so completely over the top, that when he described it publicly, the writer covering the story felt compelled to ask his readers whether this guy was actually serious. In the May 1964 issue of Popular Hot Rodding, Lytle laid it out himself in his own word. "My next project, which will begin as soon as I am able to locate additional Allison engines at a reasonable price, will be a 4-engine competition coupe. 8,000 horsepower, 9,200 foot-pounds of torque, 6,840 cubic inches, a weight of 7,000 pounds. The engines will be linked in pairs using truck flywheels and driven through 5-disc clutches. 2 engines will drive the front 10-inch dual slicks, and 2 the rear." The writer, Ralph Gall, closed his piece with this observation. The question in your mind from the foregoing is whether this guy is for real. Well, Jim does have a sturdy imagination, but I remember when he outlined the plans for the just as improbable Big L2, and he had the same look in his eye. That look meant something, because what came next was the Quad L. After selling Big L2, Jim Lytle launched full bore into the most ambitious project of his life. And look, when we say full bore, we mean that in the most literal sense possible. This was not a guy who sketched something out on a napkin and then lost interest. This was not a garage fantasy that never made it past the daydream stage. Lytle was methodical. He was deliberate. And before he touched a single piece of metal or sourced a single engine, he did something that tells you exactly how his mind worked. He built a scale model first. Using 4 Allison V12 model kits and a Fiat Topolino coupe kit, he assembled a plastic representation of what the finished car would look like. And that model turned out to be eerily, almost unsettlingly close to what the actual finished machine would eventually become. The proportions were right. The layout was right. The general configuration was right. This was not a guy who winged it. This was a guy who thought it all the way through before he ever picked up a wrench. Over the course of a 6-month build, working largely alone and largely on his own dime, he made the exact thing he had described to Popular Hot Rodding. And when it was finished, the Quad Al was one of the most visually arresting automobiles ever constructed by any human being for any purpose at any point in history. Consider the dimensions for a moment. A 160-inch wheelbase. 4 massive Allison V12 engines lined up in a row down the center of the car. The almost comically small Cal automotive fiberglass coupe body, a replica of a Fiat 500 Topolino, sitting on top of all of that mechanical fury. 8 slick tires, 2 per corner. The sheer physical scope of this machine is genuinely difficult to process even in photograph. In person, by all accounts from people who were there, it was simply overwhelming. It looked like something from a cartoon, except that every single component of it was real, functional, engineered hardware. Now let's get into the technical details, because this is where it gets really interesting and where you start to appreciate just how deeply Lytle had thought through every aspect of this build. The engine configuration was specific and deliberate. The front pair of Allisons faced backward in the chassis. The rear pair faced forward, tilted 15 degrees to align the throttle linkage correctly. Getting 4 aircraft engines to work together in a single vehicle is not a matter of simply bolting them in and connecting them. The rotational dynamics alone are a serious engineering challenge. 2 of the engines were left-hand rotation unit. 2 were right-hand rotation. This was intentional, designed to cancel out the gyroscopic forces that 4 spinning V12 cranks would otherwise generate and that would make the car essentially impossible to steer in a straight line. Lytle had planned to mesh the engines together using Model 450 International truck flywheels, and he managed to accomplish exactly that, but it required laying the engines over at that 15-degree angle and performing significant work on the front accessory drives to get the mesh to actually function as intended. This is the kind of problem that a professional engineering team with a budget and a machine shop might spend weeks solving. Lytle solved it in his garage. He fabricated 18-inch diameter torque tubes to tie the car together structurally from front to rear, larger versions of the same solution he had developed for Big Al years earlier. The problem had scaled up. So had the solution. He had planned on using hydraulically operated 6-disc clutches to manage the power transfer, sending the output of all 4 engines to a rear axle built from 2 1957 Pontiac center sections running 2.41 gears. Those center sections were fitted with Ford 1.5-ton truck ends, axles, and hubs to handle the loads involved. Up front, the steer axle came from a 2.5-ton military truck, also geared at 2.41, with massive Rzepa CV joints on the ends to allow for actual steering input. Now, you might be thinking, okay, how do you actually steer a 7,000-pound machine with 4 aircraft engines in it? The answer is both elegant and slightly terrifying. A 1965 Buick steering box was connected via a 14-foot-long steering shaft running the length of the car to the cockpit positioned at the very front of the chassis. 14 feet of steering shaft. The driver sat at the nose of the car, ahead of all 4 engines, turning a wheel connected to a box 14 feet behind him. The frame rails were constructed from 3-inch square tubing with walls a 1/4 inch thick. The roll cage area used 2-inch square tubing, also a 1/4 inch thick. This car was not built to flex. It was not built to be light. It was built the way Lytle built everything, which is to say it was built to work and to survive whatever it was asked to endure. The wheels were custom fabricated using Quinn steel plate center sections that Lytle welded up himself, because of course he did, because wheels that could handle this application did not exist in any catalog anywhere on Earth. Here's what most people don't realize when they look at photographs of the Quad L. The scale of the ancillary systems required to run 4 V12 aircraft engines simultaneously is almost as impressive as the engines themselves. The car used a combined total of 350 feet of Packard 440 spark plug wire. 350 feet. 4 magnetos handled ignition duties across the 48 cylinders. The exhaust system comprised 96 individual pipes. Think about that for a moment. 96 exhaust pipes on a single vehicle. 4 Stromberg 2-barrel carburetors provided fuel delivery, each unit rated at 40 pounds flow capacity, because 4 aircraft engines burning through fuel at full throttle require a supply system that is essentially agricultural in its scale. Moon Equipment donated the fuel tank. Champion spark plugs provided special unshrouded racing plugs, specifically the same plugs that had been developed for Allison-powered hydroplanes, because those were the only plugs that had been proven to survive in this exact application. Cal Automotive provided the Topolino fiberglass body. The throttle system was an act of engineering unto itself. Getting 4 separate aircraft engines to respond simultaneously and proportionally to a single throttle input required a series of bell cranks and linkages that Lytle designed and fabricated from scratch. The total displacement across all 4 engines was 6,840 cubic inches, nearly 7,000 cubic inches of piston engine in a single vehicle. The total weight of the finished machine was approximately 7,000 pounds. The total financial investment when the car sat mechanically complete was approximately $2,000. $2,000 for what was being described as the most powerful piston-engine vehicle ever conceived by human beings. That number is so absurd in context that it almost sounds like a misprint. But it is accurate, and the reason it is accurate goes back to that surplus market we discussed earlier. The engines, those four massive, historically significant, extraordinarily capable Allison V12s, cost almost nothing because the government was practically giving away military hardware. The raw materials, the steel tubing, the plate stock, the hardware, the fittings, the linkages, all of it was within reach of a man making $110 a week as a design draftsman if he was willing to be creative and patient and relentlessly resourceful. Lytle was all three of those things at a level that most people simply are not. And here is a quote from him that puts his philosophy into perfect focus, because he said it himself in that same popular hot rodding piece, and it deserves to be repeated in full. He said, "I feel I am part of a dying breed of the do-it-yourself school of hot rodding. With the present-day facilities, 98% of the rodders are assemblers, not builders. The only thing I shop out is lathe work, and the day I buy my own lathe, I will do 100% of my own work." That distinction he draws between assemblers and builders is not casual. It is the entire philosophical foundation of what the Quad L represent. Anyone with enough money can assemble a fast car from available component. What Lytle was doing was fundamentally different. He was creating solutions that did not previously exist, manufacturing components that were not available anywhere, and doing it on a working man's salary because the intellectual challenge of the problem was more motivating to him than any prize money or fame the finished product might generate. The car attracted enormous attention even before it was complete. People who visited Lytle's shop during the build came away with the kind of stunned expression usually reserved for witnessing something genuinely unprecedented. Because that is what it was. There was no reference point for it. No comparable machine existed anywhere in the world. The closest thing was probably the green monster that Art Arfons was campaigning on the Bonneville Salt Flats during the same period, but even that was a single-engine car. The Quad L was operating in territory that no one had ever explored before, and it was being built by one man in a private shop with hand tools and surplus parts and an absolutely extraordinary ability to figure things out. When the car was finally complete enough to be shown publicly, the reaction was everything you would expect and then some. People walked around it slowly, trying to make sense of the proportions. The tiny Topolino body perched on top of those four massive engines created a visual contrast that was genuinely comic in its extremity. It looked impossible. It looked like a joke. And then you got close enough to touch it and realize that every single component was real, that the engineering behind it was sound, that a man had actually thought all of this through and built it with his own hands, and the comedy transformed into something closer to awe. The Quad L represented a very specific moment in American hot rodding history. A moment when the surplus market had made military-grade hardware accessible to ordinary people, when the sport was young enough that there were no established rules about what was possible or appropriate, and when a certain type of mechanically gifted individual could still do something that had genuinely never been done before without a corporate sponsor or a factory budget or a team of engineers. Jim Lytle was the last and perhaps greatest expression of that particular tradition. And what he built in that shop was its ultimate monument. So what did it run? What were the numbers? How fast was the Quad L? This is the question that everyone asks, and the answer is simultaneously the most disappointing and the most fascinating part of this entire story. This car, this machine that you have undoubtedly seen photographs of floating around the internet for years, that you have probably encountered in forum threads and social media posts and compilation videos about the wildest machines in drag racing history, never moved a single inch under its own power. Not 1 inch. Not 1 foot. Not one pass down a drag strip. Not even a slow roll across a parking lot. 0 inches of wheel-driven forward progress have ever been made by the Quad Al. None. Ever. And the reason for that is so perfectly, painfully human that it almost feels like the punchline to a cosmic joke about ambition and economic money. That is what happened. Jim Lytle was a regular guy with a regular job as a design draftsman, making approximately $110 a week. He had managed to get the car mechanically complete in its basic form for about $2,000, which, as we have already established, was an almost unbelievable achievement given the scope of the project. But when he reached the stage where the car needed its clutches, its custom ring and pinion gears, and the other precision final drive components that would actually allow power to be transferred from those 4 screaming Allison V12s to the 8 slick tires, he was looking at a price tag of approximately $5,000. In 1960s money, that was a wall he simply could not climb over. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $50,000 today. And that was absolutely not in his budget. Here is the thing about that. Think about the irony for just a moment. Really let it settle in. 12,000 horsepower worth of surplus military aircraft engines had cost less than $500 total. The engines, the most spectacular and expensive components of any vehicle, the parts that represented decades of government-funded research and development and millions of dollars in original manufacturing costs, those were essentially free. But the precision components needed to actually harness that power, the clutches, the gears, the ring and pinions, the machined parts that turn theoretical horsepower into actual wheel-driven forward motion, those cost 10 times what the engines did. The most powerful piston-engine car ever conceived had been stopped dead in its tracks by sane financial decision-making. The outlandish creation had met its match not in physics, not in engineering, not in structural failure or component limitations, but in the prosaic reality that a working man in the mid-1960s could not write a $5,000 check. And look, this is where the story of the Quad Al becomes something more than just a tale about a weird car. This is where it becomes a parable about the golden age of drag racing itself. That era celebrated the shade tree builder who could outthink the factories. It celebrated the backyard genius who could weld and fabricate and innovate his way past the corporate teams with their budgets and their engineers and their unlimited resources. Jim Lytle proved, definitively and spectacularly, that you could build the most powerful piston-engine car in the world in your own shop for $2,000. What he could not do was afford the machine work to finish it. The dream had outpaced the dreamer's checkbook, and that gap was never closed. In late 1965, the Quad Al found a new owner. Tex Collins, who by that time had acquired Big L2 and who owned roughly a dozen Allison engines himself, including an Allison-powered Mustang funny car, purchased the Quad Al and its trailer for $4,000. Lytle once again made a small profit on one of his creations, and once again, having sold the thing he had built, he moved on. The building was the point. The transaction was just the ending of one chapter and the beginning of the next. Now, Collins was an interesting character in his own right. He was a Hollywood stuntman, a guy who made his living doing dangerous things for entertainment, which perhaps explains why a 4-engine aircraft-powered drag car struck him as a reasonable purchase. In 1967, he would buy Cal Automotive, the company that had provided the Topolino body for the Quad Al in the first place. Collins had the means and the connections and potentially the resources to actually finish the car and put it on a drag strip. He had the engines. He had the industry relationship. He had the experience with Allison-powered machines from his own racing program. If anyone in the world could have brought the Quad Al to life, it was probably Tex Collins. Except that never happened. And what happened to Tex Collins next gets murky in a way that adds an unexpectedly dark thread to this whole narrative. Collins was killed in October of 1976 under circumstances that remain disputed to this day. He was 49 years old. Some accounts describe a business franchise dispute that escalated into violence. Others mention a debt collection that went catastrophically wrong. His son, Frank Collins, has stated publicly on multiple occasions that no one has actually told the story of his father's death correctly. Whatever the truth is, the result was that Tex Collins was gone, and with him went the most realistic chance the Quad L ever had of being completed and run. After Collins died, his widow sold all 12 of his Allison engines separately. The market for those engines was still relatively modest in the late 1970s, so they dispersed into the hands of various collectors and racers across the country. The Quad L chassis, however, somehow remained intact as a single unit and began a long, slow journey through a series of owners. 2 California racing brothers acquired it at some point, then a gentleman in Nebraska, then a collector named Cy Cubista, then Wally Miller in Wisconsin. Each transfer moved the car further from its origins and further from any realistic prospect of completion. Along the way, parts were removed, lost, sold off, or simply deteriorated. The Allison engines were long gone. Most of the ancillary systems had been stripped. By the time the car had passed through its 4th or 5th owner, it was a shell of its former self in the most literal sense. The frame was there. The wheels were there. The dual bell housings remained. Everything else had vanished over the course of 3 decades of changing hands and sitting in various garages and storage facilities. Now here is where the economics of this story take a turn that is almost too perfectly ironic to believe. Those Allison V12 engines that cost $50 to $150 each in 1965, the ones that Jim Lytle sourced from junkyards and surplus auctions for pocket change? By the mid-1990s, those same engines were worth approximately $30,000 each. The surplus era was completely over. The supply of cheap military hardware that had fueled an entire generation of hot rod innovation had dried up decades earlier. The engines that had made the Quad L possible for $2,000 were now worth more than $100,000 as a set of 4. The thing that had been absurdly cheap had become absurdly expensive, and the window during which a regular guy with a regular job could build something like the Quad L had closed permanently. In 1994, a collector named Mike Guffey from Hartford City, Indiana, acquired the Quad L from Wally Miller. By that point, as we have already described, only the frame, the wheels, and the dual bell housings remained of the original car. Everything else was gone. Guffey wanted to restore the car, and his passion for the project was genuine. But the economics made a functional restoration essentially impossible. Real Allison V12 engines at $30,000 each meant $120,000 just for engines. 60 times what Lytle had spent building the entire car from scratch. And that is before you consider the clutches, the gears, the ring and pinions, the drive components, the fuel systems, the ignition systems, all the other precision hardware that would be required to make the car actually run. A complete, functional restoration would have cost more money than most houses were worth in the 1990s. So Guffey did something else entirely. Something that, depending on your perspective, is either a compromise or a perfectly appropriate tribute to a car that was never finished in the first place. He placed 4 mocked-up Allison engines back in the Quad AL's frame. These are essentially blocks with valve covers and intake manifolds bolted to them. They look like Allison V12s from a few feet away, but they are not functional power plants. He sourced a new Topolino fiberglass body to replace the original that had been lost or damaged over the years. The result is a cosmetic restoration that allows the car to be shown and displayed in essentially the same visual state it existed in during the mid-1960s. A perpetually unfinished monument to one man's extraordinary ambition, preserved in its perpetually unfinished form. Guffey himself has spoken about the car with the kind of affection that collectors reserve for their most meaningful acquisitions. How many people own a car that was in the Guinness Book of World Records and was powered by 4 aircraft engines that helped us win World War II? He has said, "I have got a lot of neat stuff, but no other stuff like that." That Guinness reference is accurate and significant. The Quad Al was listed in the Guinness Book of World Records from 1974 through the late 1980s as the most powerful piston-engine car ever built. Think about that. The record stood for over a decade for a car that never moved under its own power, never ran, never made a pass, never turned a wheel in anger, but it held a world record for raw potential, for what it theoretically could have done if those clutches and gears had ever been installed and those 4 engines had ever been fired simultaneously. Now, people talk about the car being 12,000 horsepower, and it was touted as such on magazine covers back in the day. 12,000 horsepower. That number has been repeated so many times in so many publications and so many internet posts that it has essentially become accepted fact. But look, we need to be honest about this because intellectual honesty matters more than a good headline. The 12,000 horsepower figure is entirely academic. It is a theoretical maximum based on extrapolation from modified racing variants of the Allison V12, not a measured output from these specific engines in this specific configuration. The engines in the Quad Al were never dyno tested. They were never fired together. They were never run under load. The combined power output of 4 Allison V12s in the Quad Al is, in the most accurate technical sense, completely unknowable. Here is what we do know. Stock military Allison V1710s produced between 1,100 and 1,600 horsepower depending on the variant, the supercharger configuration, and the fuel grade. The 3,000 horsepower per engine figure that gets multiplied by 4 to arrive at that legendary 12,000 number comes from the most extreme modified racing variants, the ones built specifically for unlimited hydroplane competition with extensively reworked supercharger systems, custom fuel delivery, and operating parameters that would have been completely inappropriate and probably destructive in an aircraft application. Whether 4 Allison engines installed in the Quad AL's frame, meshed together through truck flywheels, fed by Stromberg carburetors, and operating through a mechanical throttle linkage system, would have actually produced 12,000 combined horsepower is a question that can never be answered because the experiment was never conducted. The car could be listed as 100,000 horsepower and the claim would carry exactly the same evidentiary weight, which is to say none at all. In practical reality, your riding lawn mower has produced more measurable wheel horsepower than the Quad Al ever has. And yet, somehow, that does not diminish what the car represents. If anything, it makes the story more interesting. The Quad Al exists in this strange liminal space between engineering achievement and engineering aspiration. It is simultaneously the most powerful piston-engine car ever built and a machine that has never demonstrated any power whatsoever. It is both the ultimate expression of hot rod ambition and the ultimate cautionary tale about the gap between building something and making it work. It is Schrödinger's drag car. The horsepower is both there and not there, depending entirely on whether you ever open the box and try to run the thing. And the box was never opened. Here is what most people don't realize about Jim Lytle's life after the Quad Al. The story does not end with him sitting in a chair somewhere, staring at old photographs and wondering what might have been. That is not who this man was. Remember, the building was always the point. The Quad Al was the most extreme expression of his abilities, but it was not the final one. After selling the car to Tex Collins in 1965, Lytle kept working, kept building, kept applying that extraordinary mind and those extraordinary hands to new problems. By 1967, he had landed a position that validated everything he had ever done in his garage. He was working as a fabricator on the crew that built the STP turbine Indy car for Andy Granatelli at the Paxton Division Shop in Santa Monica, California. Now, if you know your racing history, you know exactly how significant that car was. The STP turbine car was one of the most revolutionary and controversial machines ever to appear at the Indianapolis 500. It was powered by a Pratt & Whitney gas turbine engine, it used four-wheel drive, and it very nearly won the race in 1967 before a transmission-bearing failure on the final laps handed the victory to A.J. Foyt. The car was so fast and so dominant that it changed the rules of Indianapolis racing permanently. And Jim Lytle, the guy from Michigan who built aircraft engine-powered drag cars in his garage for $2,000, was part of the team that fabricated it. The same skills that produced Big Al and Big Al2 and the Quad Al were recognized at the highest levels of professional motorsport engineering. This was not a hobby machinist who got lucky. This was a genuinely talented engineer who happened to work outside the conventional system because that was where his personality and his philosophy led him. The do-it-yourself school of hot rodding that he described himself as belonging to was not a limitation. It was a training ground that produced skills of the highest caliber, skills that the professional racing world was more than happy to employ when given the opportunity. Eventually, Lytle moved to Hawaii, which is about as far from the Southern California drag racing scene as you can get while still remaining in the United States. He ran an auto repair shop there for more than 20 years. By all accounts, he was the kind of mechanic that people drove across the island to visit because word had gotten around that this particular guy could fix anything. And if you have been paying attention to this story, that reputation makes perfect sense. A man who could build a 4-engine aircraft-powered drag car from scratch could certainly diagnose your Honda's oil leak. Jim Lytle passed away in 2011. But before his death, he learned that Mike Guffey had acquired the Quad Al and was working to restore it cosmetically. There is something meaningful in that, knowing that your most ambitious creation had survived even if it never did what you built it to do. The car had outlived its builder's ability to finish it, had outlived its second owner entirely, had passed through half a dozen hands over nearly 5 decades, and had somehow emerged on the other side still recognizable, still intact in its essential form, still capable of inspiring the same mix of disbelief and admiration that it generated when it was first shown to the public in the mid-1960s. The Big Al2 body, the one with the revolutionary liftoff design that directly influenced the development of funny car bodywork, survives today at the Don Garlits Museum of Drag Racing in Ocala, Florida. That is Lytle's lasting and most tangible contribution to the sport as it exists today. Not the 12,000 horsepower that never moved. The body design that helped shape an entire class of racing. Every funny car that has ever staged at a drag strip, every nitro-burning, tire-smoking, quarter-mile covering machine with a flip-up body, carries a trace of DNA that leads back to Jim Lytle's shop and the problem he solved when his doors kept flying open at 150 miles per hour. That is a legacy that matters, even if it is not the legacy that makes for the most dramatic headline. The Quad Al sits today in Mike Guffey's collection in Hartford City, Indiana. It has been displayed at events like the Ducktail Run in Gas City, where it continues to generate exactly the same reaction it always has. People walk around it slowly. They try to process the proportions. They count the engines. They look at the tiny Topolino body, and then look at the 4 massive V12 blocks, and their brains struggle to reconcile the two things as parts of the same machine. It is a car that resists casual understanding. You cannot glance at it and move on. It demands that you stop and think about what you are seeing, and then think about the person who saw all of this in his mind before a single piece of metal was cut. If you were around the Southern California hot rod and drag racing scene in the mid-1960s, if you happened to visit a shop or attend a show before Tex Collins hauled the Quad Al away on its trailer, that memory might be one of the only first-hand eyewitness accounts still in existence. The number of people alive today who saw this car in person during its original era is dwindling with every passing year. The photographs survive. The magazine articles survive. The Guinness Book entry survived for over a decade. But the lived experience of standing next to this machine and comprehending its scale and its audacity, that is fading into the kind of history that exists only in the minds of the people who were there. And this is where I want to make a point about what the Quad Al really means in the broader context of American automotive history, because I think most people miss it entirely. The Quad Al is not significant because of its horsepower, theoretical or otherwise. It is not significant because it held a Guinness World Record. It is not significant because it was big or loud or visually spectacular, although it was certainly all of those things. The Quad Al is significant because it represents the absolute outer boundary of what one person, working alone, with minimal resources and maximum ingenuity, could achieve during a very specific window of American history. A window when surplus military hardware was cheap, when the sport of drag racing was young enough to have no established limits on what was permissible, and when a certain kind of mechanical genius could still operate entirely outside the institutional framework and produce something that no institution would have ever approved, funded, or even imagined. That window closed. It closed because the surplus dried up, because the sport professionalized, because the economics shifted, because insurance and liability and sanctioning body regulations and corporate sponsorship requirements gradually squeezed out the shade tree builders and replaced them with teams and budgets and engineering departments. None of that is inherently bad. The sport evolved. The cars got faster. The safety improved dramatically. The professionalization of drag racing saved lives and created careers and built an industry worth billions of dollars. But something was lost in that transition, and the Quad Al is the physical monument to what was lost. It is the last and most extreme artifact of an era when a man with $100 junkyard engine and a shop full of hand tools could look at the fastest cars in the world and think, I can beat that, and then actually set about trying to do it. Now, you might be thinking that the Quad Al is ultimately a failure. A car that never ran. A project that was never completed. 12,000 horsepower of unfulfilled potential gathering dust in an Indiana collection. And from a purely functional standpoint, that assessment is accurate. The car does not work. It has never worked. It almost certainly will never work, because the economics that would be required to make it functional have inverted so completely from the conditions under which it was built that a restoration to running condition would cost more than most people's retirement savings. The engines alone would run north of $120,000. The precision drive components that stopped Lytle in 1965 would cost even more today, adjusted for the specialized nature of the machining required. A running Quad Al is, for all practical purposes, an impossibility in the modern era. But here is where I think that purely functional assessment misses the point entirely. The value of the Quad Al was never in what it did. It was in what it proved could be conceived, designed, and largely constructed by a single human being working alone. Jim Lytle did not fail. He succeeded at approximately 95% of an engineering challenge that no one else on Earth had ever attempted. He sourced the engines. He configured them. He solved the rotation problem. He built the frame. He fabricated the torque tubes. He designed the throttle linkage. He assembled the ignition system with its 350 feet of spark plug wire. He mounted the body. He did everything except the final 5%, the precision machine drive components that his salary could not cover. And that 5% gap between completion and incompletion has defined the car's legacy for 60 years. Think about that for a second. Think about what it means that we are still talking about this car 6 decades after it was built. Think about what it means that the Guinness Book of World Records saw fit to list it for over a decade. Think about what it means that magazines covered it, that collectors have preserved it, that it has been displayed at events and discussed in forums and featured in videos watched by millions of people around the world. A car that never ran. A car that never produced a single measurable unit of forward motion. And yet here we are, still captivated by it, still trying to understand it, still marveling at the mind that imagined it and the hands that built it. Here is the truth that the Quad Al teaches us if we are willing to listen. The most interesting things in automotive history are not always the things that worked perfectly. Sometimes the most interesting things are the ones that reached so far beyond what was reasonable that they could not quite close the gap between vision and reality. The Quad L reached further than anything before or since. It reached for a place where 4 World War II fighter plane engines could propel a tiny Italian coupe body down a quarter-mile drag strip at speeds that no one could even calculate because the attempt was never made. It reached for absurdity and landed somewhere in the neighborhood of legend. Jim Lytle spent his life building things. Cars, engines, clutches, bodies, torque tubes, components that did not exist until he made them. He built Big Al and proved that an aircraft engine could power a drag car. He built Big L too and proved that a one-piece fiberglass sedan body could revolutionize an entire class of motorsport. He worked on the STP turbine Indy car and proved that his skills were world-class. He ran a repair shop in Hawaii for 20 years and proved that the most sophisticated mechanical mind could also be the most practical one. And in between all of that, he built the Quad L, and he proved that the human imagination has no displacement limit. The Quad L sits in Indiana. Big Al 2's body sits in Florida. Jim Lytle rests somewhere in between, his legacy scattered across the country in fiberglass and steel and the memories of people who saw what he built and could not quite believe their eyes. And that is the whole weird, wonderful, heartbreaking, and ultimately inspiring story of the drag racing monster that never turned a tire in anger. A machine born from surplus engines and a singular mind. A machine that held a world record for power it never produced. A machine that proved you could build the impossible for $2,000 but could not buy the last 5% for $5,000 more. The Quad L, Jim Lytle's masterpiece. Forever unfinished. Forever unforgettable. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about what one person can accomplish with enough skill and enough stubbornness and enough 5-cent horsepower, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment telling me what you think would have happened if Lytle had found that $5,000. And give this video a thumbs up so more people can hear about the most powerful car that never moved an inch. I will see you in the next one.